Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Julian. It doesn't seem like a year ago at all that I was last here presenting at this conference. I remember it very well. I showed some of the on-farm videos that we'd created. And sitting at the back and taking a keen interest was my wife, Mary, who herself an experienced dry stock farmer. So this year I had a very similar thing in mind. I mean, it went well last year. Why not just continue the same tradition? I was going to feature some of our new on-farm work and make it a relatively light-hearted presentation, just the sort of one that you want to see just before you go into drinks break. But between the time when I submitted my topic for the presentation and now, things have changed, both for our farmers and for me. Now, as you know, things in the farming world have been and are particularly tough. So it seems and feels less appropriate to talk about farmers today in a light-hearted kind of a way. And then there's my world. Several months ago, Mary died from a serious illness, depression. Now, while some may say that she took her life, I prefer to say that depression took her life. Because depression is an illness, not a weakness. Depression is an illness, not a weakness. So today, rather than using this opportunity to show off our storytelling ability, I want to devote this time to telling a much more important story about depression amongst farmers. I want to talk to you about the problem, what's already being done, and the vital role that you and the organisations and the companies that you represent can do to help. Because I have absolutely no doubt that if your staff are farmer-facing, there's a lot you can do on the front line to help save lives. Now, I just want to reassure you that this is not going to be Mary's eulogy. We had a great send-off for her. We have had amazing support. But I do think that I am in this rare position to be able to talk about depression amongst farmers, because I've lived with someone who herself was a farmer who was affected by depression. I've spent a lot of time on farm working with farmers and talking to farmers over the years. And over the past few months, I've talked to a number of our close farming friends, some of them themselves affected by depression. And I've also come into contact with some outstanding health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health nurses, counsellors, who have all helped me and contributed to this talk. So, before we go any further, let's just start with you. Mental illness in New Zealand affects 1 in around 5. So that may well include some of you here today. And this talk may just bring up some stuff for you, get you thinking about your own mental health or that of someone that you're close to. So 2 things to say straight away. The first is, please don't be afraid. It's like any illness. The sooner you get onto it, the sooner it can be treated. And in terms of treatment can be extremely effective. There is so much help and treatment out there available. At the end of this talk, I'm going to put a couple of telephone numbers up that you can easily call. I'm also putting my email address up, and you're most welcome to email me in confidence, and I'll simply forward your email on to people I know that can help. Okay, so what is the problem? Well, it was Einstein who once said that if he had just 1 hour to solve a puzzle and his whole life depended on it, he would spend the first 55 minutes trying to understand the problem and just 5 minutes on the solution. Now, I don't have an hour. I've only got half an hour because then it's drinks break, and you'll probably feel like a drink after this. But before I can talk to you about what I think you can do to really help, we've just got to understand the extent and some of the root causes of the problem. Okay. That is the average number of farmers and farm workers who die every year on quad bikes. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment and then think about how much media, how much publicity, how much government regulation has gone into publicising that issue and policing the issue in an effort to get that number down. That is the average number of farmers who die from depression every year. And when you think about it, that number represents the worst case scenario. The number of farmers and farm workers with a mental illness and in the spiral of depression would be infinitely greater. Now, the thing is, when you look at statistics like that, it's very easy to forget that they actually represent people. That is 28 Marys. That is 28 farming families. That is 28 farming businesses. That is 28 farming communities that somehow have to pick up the pieces and deal with the aftermath and carry on. Of course, it isn't just farmers who are affected by depression. It is rife throughout urban New Zealand as well. But the sad fact is that the suicide rate amongst farmers is 20%, at least 20% higher. And while life is a life wherever and however it's lost, the impact of a suicide on a rural community is arguably greater. Now, losing Mary has been the very worst thing to happen in my life. But the support that we've had has just been incredible. We haven't had to cook a hot meal in about 4 months. They just keep arriving. It is very hard to keep the weight off. But in a rural community, the people's hearts are so big, but there just aren't so many people to go around. And rural communities are isolated communities. Therefore, the ripple effect of a suicide in a rural community is greater. Well, if that's the size of the problem, what on earth is causing it? Now, you'll see that I already make a direct link between farmer depression and farmer suicide. And personally, I think that that link gets lost sometimes in the media. So we read about farmers going through very tough times and that concern around the rising suicide rate. The problem is, though, that this to me leaves out a very vital step. Farmers do not end their lives because they're going through a bad time. Farmers end their lives because the bad times that they're going through can trigger the onset of a major depression. Depression is an illness that completely distorts the mind and makes it think and do totally irrational things. Now, it's impossible to prove that every farmer who ends his or her life is clinically depressed at the time, but no farmer who has survived a suicide attempt has ever said they felt well and happy at the time. So why? Why is it so much of a problem amongst farmers? Well, again, I could spend easily the next half hour talking about some of the root causes. I'm just going to summarize. To me, you can kind of break it down into 3 fundamental things: environment, triggers, and attitude. First of all, environment. We know that farmers, by the very nature of farming, tends to be physically isolated, right? So therefore, it's so much, more of an effort to get with people. Now, that's so important because we know from our own experience that if you're on a bit of a down, the very best thing to shock you out of it is always talking to someone else. It takes you out of your situation. For farmers, that's harder. But not only that, they're not just physically isolated, they could become mentally isolated. And particularly with depression, depression is a very isolating illness. They become mentally isolated because they're there often on their farms on their own for long periods of time. You get one little negative thought in your head and that thought can grow and grow. But not only that, in terms of their environment, they also live on farm. So, you can have a shite day at work, but you can leave the office and come home. That's if you've got an office job. But when you're farming, obviously, you're having a rough time. You go home, but the homestead is the office. You're surrounded by work. It is all-consuming. It's extremely hard to escape. Then there are the triggers. Now, obviously, much is made in the media about financial pressures being a real trigger, and that is significant. But the one that I think isn't talked about enough is sleep. If you want to know what really chronic depression feels like, just stay up for 3 nights in a row without any sleep, and then see how your mind starts to behave. That is actually a lot what it's like. And we know, don't we, that farming as a job is one where, particularly during lambing and calving, farmers can be extremely sleep deprived. And then thirdly, attitudes. Now, much is said about, farmers sort of having this stoic sort of approach. They are resourceful and kind of independent, right? Which is great if you're fixing a broken water pump, but it isn't so good if you're trying to fix the onset of a depression. But I think there are some other aspects here about the attitudes that aren't so much talked about. One of them is identity. Farmers are often characterized absolutely by what they do and where they do it. It's their entire identity. So for a farmer, the fear of losing their farm is the fear of losing their entire identity. And that can be a pretty scary thing. And as well as that, New Zealand farming is often very family-based and intergenerational. So here's the thing. If mum and dad were stoic and never talked about depression, well then it is infinitely harder for their son or daughter, who they may well be farming with, to front up and say that they're struggling with depression. The sins of the father are visited upon the son. Environment, triggers, and attitudes. That's why we have such a problem with farmer depression. Add to that easy access to guns, and that depression can often turn deadly. So, what's being done? Well, now we know the size of the problem and some of its root causes, let's talk about what is being done to combat depression amongst farmers. Because I'm certainly not the first person to be speaking out on the issue. There are already a number of extremely committed people and organisations that are reaching out to farmers and helping. So this is by no means the complete list, but these are just some of the organisations and initiatives that farmers that I've spoken to talk about right away. First of all, depression.org.nz. We all recognise the face of Sir John Kirwan, or JK as he likes to be known, as the very human face of depression. Now, JK fronts a whole website, depression.org.nz, that is just full of practical advice and tips and resources to help people get through. It's government funded through the Health Promotion Agency. They became so concerned about the incidence of farmer depression that they've actually devoted a whole part of the site to farmers in particular. JK is out there talking to real farmers who are telling their very real stories about depression and what they've done to get through. It's fantastic content. And then links through there to all the rest of the site. That's great stuff. On top of that, JK continues to be a tireless campaigner for mental health. He's currently sponsored by Westpac, and he's been travelling around rural areas talking to farmer meetings and farmer groups. You may well have heard him talking on the radio about it. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting JK a couple of weeks ago, and just the stories he tells about those meetings, they're both sort of heartbreaking and heartwarming in equal measure. But there is no doubt that he is addressing a very, very definite need, and it's working. And it's working by talking. Farm Strong. This was set up as a partnership between FMG Insurance and the Mental Health Foundation. There are other sponsors involved as well. Now, they take a very different approach, which is equally valid. It is focused entirely on farmer wellness. So I don't actually think there's any mention of the word depression on the site, but taking the point of view that prevention is always better than cure, it promotes a whole lot of tips for farmer wellness. As an organisation, it's already got regional hubs, and they're really building strong networks, which are obviously proving very useful and very effective at melting the isolation that farmers can feel. They've also got a cycle challenge going, which I think is just an inspired way to both promote wellness and fitness and also get farmers to take a break and get off farm, which is one of the keys to it all. As part of Farm Strong, Dr. Tom Mulholland, who was a rural GP for 25 years, he's touring around rural communities in a converted V8 Chevy ambulance, and he's really taking his message very directly to farmers, or as he describes it, giving farmers the tools to manage the top paddock between their ears. Then, of course, there are the organisations like the Rural Support Trusts, who are on the front line of supporting farmers through any crisis, flood, drought, depression. They're there. And then there are the voluntary rural organisations such as Rural Health Alliance Aotearoa. Lovely to see Michelle here. Please give everyone a wave. Doing a fantastic job as well. So, given all of that, where is the gap? With all those initiatives already underway, the question has to be, is that enough to take care of the problem? Or if it isn't, then what can you and your organisation do to help? Well, here's the thing. JK is doing great things, but not every farmer can make it to see JK speak. And even if JK is talking at a local event, that farmer may be too down or too proud or too busy to go and hear him. And the same with Farm Strong and Dr. Tom. Fantastic initiative, limited only by time and geography. Now, if they're well, engaging with Farm Strong may well help farmers to stay well. But what happens if they're getting unwell and haven't gone there and are getting into that spiral? For farmers who are isolated and falling through the gaps, what could work to reach them? And that's where you come in. I've talked to a number of clinical psychologists, resilience experts, mental health nurses, doctors, rural advocates, and most importantly, farmers about what would work to practically help farmers who have started on that spiral of depression. And you know what? The number one thing that they all point to is connection. Being able to simply connect with a person to melt their isolation and to listen. So, begs the question, who do farmers naturally connect with? Well, it's not the local GP or the local psychologist, if there happens to be one in the town, that they have to drive all the way into town to see. And neither is it always their friends, who may well be flat out carving or lambing, or they just feel uncomfortable about talking to. No, farmers will connect with their vet, their seed rep, their fert rep, their dairy company area manager, their agri-chem rep, their livestock agent, their rural banker, their nutrition advisor, their agronomist, their sustainability advisor, and so on. These are the people that, no matter how busy a farmer is, they will still talk to. These are the ones who are invited into farmers' homes and sit there and talk with farmers at the kitchen table. To farmers, these people are trusted advisors. So, if they're trusted advisors, why can't they talk about the big D. I hear gasps of anguish go up in the room. Turn our frontline into psychologists? You must be dreaming. But here's the thing, they don't need to be psychologists at all. They need to be armed with some simple tools and training just to be able to start a conversation or point a farmer or his/her partner in the right direction. Because the most important thing that's required for someone who is not in good shape mentally is empathy. Someone who actually listens without judging or offering a solution. Now, let me tell you a quick story about empathy to illustrate. In the wake of Mary's death, I had to sort out a whole lot of horrible admin stuff. And one of the things I had to do was respond to the Inland Revenue Department, that glorious institution, because they sent Mary a letter that I duly opened, advising us that our GST was overdue by a matter of hours, I think. So I rang the Inland Revenue Department, was put through to someone. I had my tax number there. I was all good to go. And I very politely and clearly said to her, explained the situation. I said, but I'm very sorry that it's late, but Mary died. To which they replied, oh, okay. And I said, no, it's not okay. She said, sorry? And I said, well, that may have been a better response. It was lost on her. So I was a little angry when I got off the phone to Inland Revenue. So next, I had to ring the insurance company. That was next on my to-do list. I had to ring the insurance company to change our household insurance policy from joint name over to my name. It's just a formality, but if you don't do it and your house burns down, well, then you're kind of screwed, right? So, having just got off the phone to Inland Revenue, I'm feeling a little gun-shy, but I rang the insurance company and had exactly the same conversation, explained to her what happened. Right, what did she say? I'm so sorry to hear that, Matt. That is terrible. Yes, of course I can help you. It's no problem. It's easy. But before we do that, may I just ask you a question? And I said, yes. And she said, how are you? Because you must be going through hell. It still gives me shivers, actually, thinking about this, right? If there's one thing in this talk that makes me tear up, it'll be that. Now, that, my friends, is a simple example of empathy. And it made the absolute world of difference to me at the time. And I can tell you this, every other insurance company can try as hard as they like, and they can make the most beautiful commercials and send me the most incredible DMs and everything else, but they will never, ever have my business. My insurance company has got me as a loyal customer for life from that one experience of empathy. Resilience expert and psychologist Richard Whitney suggests that naturally, rural reps have an agenda when they go and visit their clients. So although they may ask, how are you? It's really as a lead-in to the main items they want to cover. Or as he calls it, they're in broadcast mode. Instead, he suggests devoting the first couple of minutes of the conversation to, how are you? See, it's a really simple change, but it makes the world of difference. Not, how are you? How are you? And then he says, just devote a couple of moments to being mindful and aware of their answer. Psychologist Kirsty Loudon-Bell, who has worked very closely with J.K. on his last book, which is a beauty, and you should all read it, talks about how frequently our gut might tell us that something is up with someone, but we don't want to say anything because we just don't feel like it's our place. Well, the reality is that you don't have to offer a solution. It's just a listening ear. Or as one farmer friend of mine who has experienced depression themselves simply said, we don't need someone to turn up with a solution. We just need a kind face to turn up and listen to the problem. And in fact, frontline staff, your frontline staff, in that respect, could actually be more effective than professional counsellors. And I'll tell you why. Because it's very hard to teach a professional counsellor all about farming. And the nature of the farmer's problems are all to do with farming. It's actually much easier to teach someone who knows a lot about farming just a few of the basics about counselling. Now, I haven't spoken to a single farmer or mental health expert who has yet to tell me that what I'm suggesting is a bad idea. So that either means that they feel sorry for me, or that maybe they just think that I'm on the right track. But there is one issue, isn't there, that they all bring up, and no doubt you're thinking it too, and that is how to overcome the fear of embarrassing the farmer if they do appear depressed. Because come on, it's not going to work if you've got the sales rep who comes up the drive, knocks on the door, sees Tom is looking pretty dishevelled, says, "G'day Tom, mate, you look pretty dishevelled," and I now understand that that's one of the warning signs of deteriorating mental health. So, mate, you're probably depressed, here's a number to call. That sort of interaction may not work too well for either side. But imagine if that same rep approaches the same farmer, but instead says, "Hey Tom, Sue, obviously I'm here to hear how everything's going, but before we get into that, hey look, here's a simple booklet that we've put together. And it's just all about depression amongst farmers. Now, this is actually something that we're giving to every farmer, every one of our rural customers. So just in case you guys happen to know of a neighbour or a mate, someone in your discussion group, here's something that you may want to pass on. Or look, it's got a whole lot of useful websites and 0800 numbers to call. Just going to leave this with you for you guys to pass on." So, I mean, that just kind of like takes it away from being about the individual and more just about the issue generally. Now, it's not going to do any harm, and it may actually just do a whole lot of good. That's what I'm asking you and the organisations you work for essentially to do, okay? Just train your frontline staff in the basics and arm them with the simple tools they need to get in front of farmers and refer them to the right channels. And supporting that, why not make that same information easily accessible on your websites? Simple. Why you? Well, I would have thought the reasons why you should pick up the cause are fairly obvious. You will be helping to save lives. But look, on a purely commercial basis, right, you will be laying down strong foundations for lifetime customer loyalty. Just think back about my experience with the insurance company. That is what we're talking about. So there is actually a real upside, a huge upside, purely commercially. The real risk, I think, is that, for example, FMG Insurance already support FarmStrong, then other insurance companies are going to be less inclined to also promote mental well-being amongst their farmers. Because they're going to go, "Yeah, no, that depression thing, yeah, that's kind of already been done by FMG." Or because Westpac sponsored JK, the other banks are going to be less inclined to promote their own initiatives of mental well-being with farmers. Well, what I'm advocating is that any and every rural business that has direct farmer contact should have a program in place to help them manage depression as part of your overall social contract. You all have health and safety policies. So how about mental health? One of my concerns with giving this talk today was that my agency, Shirtcliffe & Co., is seen to somehow be commercialising this opportunity. So here's the thing. If you would like help to develop some basic tools on depression and a training program for your frontline staff, I'm more than happy just to talk to you, right? It costs nothing to talk. And as you can understand, it's a personal passion of mine. But this is not about the health and survival of our business. This is about the health and the survival of your farmers. It seems to me that in this day and age, we actually live not in an age of reason, we live in an age of blame. So we're actually much more concerned about blaming people for things rather than actually looking at working together on an effective solution. So look, please understand that I'm not angry, and I don't blame anyone, least of all not you, good folk here today, for the appalling rate of farmer suicide and depression. But look, I truly believe that you here today can help with the solution. So next year, I already know what my topic is going to be, if I'm allowed back. Walking another mile in their boots. I'm hoping you'll take this message on board and act on it. Because next year, I want to look at every organisation that's here today and ask them to share their stories about how they've taken the battle against farmer depression to the front line. So I'm looking forward to next year already. Shortly after Mary died, I asked for a meeting with her clinicians, just so we could have a debrief and look at any learnings. And while there may have been one or two things we could have done differently, what came through so strongly was that everyone had tried so hard and they had just done their very, very best. And knowing that gives me great peace. I've spent very little time thinking, what if? Which has given me so much more time to think, what now? And I think that should be the ultimate test. If a farmer loses their battle with depression, you just need to ask, did we do everything we could? Thank you.